Fedor Dostoevsky, Chapter 1. Among the 21 condemned men to be shot for revolutionary activities at 7 o'clock on the morning of December 22nd, 1849 was Fedor Dostoevsky. They were led out into the prison yard to stand on the scaffold, and the officer in charge read to each the fatal words of the verdict, quote, "Sentenced to be shot," close quote. The prisoners' clothes had to be taken off, and for 20 minutes they waited in ice-cold temperatures for the final moment to come. Dostoevsky embraced two of his friends in the last farewell. He wrote later of this quote-unquote last moment, quote, "I kept staring at a church with a gilt dome reflecting the sunbeams, and I suddenly felt as if those beams came from the region where I myself was going to be in a few minutes," close quote. Suddenly an officer came galloping across the square, signaling with a handkerchief to announce that the Tsar Nicholas I, quote, "in his infinite mercy," close quote, had commuted the death sentence to prison terms in Siberia. This cruel staging of the execution had been intended as, quote, "a lesson never to be forgotten," close quote. It had indeed a lasting effect, and not only on Dostoevsky. Grigoriev, one of the condemned men, became insane. Others suffered nervous breakdowns, contracted incurable diseases of the lungs, and had their ears and toes frozen. Dostoevsky did not remember having felt the cold at all. The minutes were one of those terrifying ultimate experiences to which his writings frequently referred. All the agonies which another Russian writer, Leonid Andreyev, described so vividly in his short novel, The Seven Who Were Hanged, were there, notably the contradiction of life to a last agonizing panorama before death comes to wipe out all hope, guilt, and memory. It is no wonder that Dostoevsky's epilepsy has been traced to this terrible moment as much as to his Siberian imprisonment. Although he apparently had his first seizure as a boy after hearing that his father had been murdered. On this December morning, young Dostoevsky had been on the brink of despair and death in an experience that was not only to shape his own work, but also to give to all mankind an insight into the depth of human error and suffering. For Dostoevsky could convey this with more power than practically any other writer. Fedor M. Dostoevsky was born in Moscow in 1821, the same year in which Gustav Flaubert, also an epileptic, was born in the same milieu. Dostoevsky's father, an ex-army surgeon, was employed in a hospital for the poor, and the family occupied an apartment in one of the hospital buildings. This environment of poverty and misery made a lasting impression on the boy. The family had scarcely any cultural interests. His father, who was an erratic and irritable alcoholic, acquired a small farm in the Tula region, where he treated his few serfs so badly that they murdered him when Fedor was 16 years of age. At 17, Fedor entered the St. Petersburg College for Military Engineering, where he soon withdrew from the company of his socially superior comrades, spending his time in reading all of the poetry and novels available. The range of his reading was enormous, and uneven merit, and hardly suited to shape his critical judgment. He read Homer, Shakespeare, Gertrude, Schiller, Corneille, Racine, Gogol, and Victor Hugo, in addition to a weird assortment of melodramatic and historical fiction. St. Petersburg remained an unreal, quote-unquote, magical vision of dream that gave him the first vague, quote-unquote, hints and tokens of the strange human scene of whose description he was soon to become a master. He had no share in the city's social life and was not admitted to the circles of government officials, but he absorbed the magic of the city's icy nights and the remote human climate of its men and women with a psychic intuition that set his soul in searching after the hidden, the strange, and the darkly romantic. After graduation, Dostoevsky decided to abandon his military career in favor of writing. His first book, Poor Folk, was enthusiastically acclaimed by leading critics, but his initial luck as a writer vanished with the publication of his next 2 or 3 novels, profound as they were in their psychological insight. In April 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested as a member of a socialist group of middle-class liberals interested in Fourier's theories. And a little more than half a year later, there occurred the staging of the execution that was followed by 4 years of imprisonment in Omsk, Siberia. These years brought him more than anguish and terror. The young writer's extraordinary resilience caused him years later to remark rather boastfully, quote, "I have the vitality of a cat," close quote. He displayed it even at the moment when he left for Siberia. Before his actual departure, he wrote to his beloved brother Mikhail of the, quote, "abundant and healthy kind of spiritual life," close quote, seething in him as it had never before. Quote, "I shall be born again for the best. This is all my hope, all my comfort," close quote. There was no complaint about the punishment and suffering, both of which he readily accepted. In much the same way, many characters of his last novels were to confess their sins and do penance for the purification of their souls. His Memories of the House of the Dead is a harrowing description of his years in the filthy Siberian prison, where he had lived in the company of thieves, murderers, and other criminals. Yet his attitude towards his fellow prisoners was often one of real sympathy and curiosity. His comrade in chains on the way to Siberia, a Polish fellow prisoner, Jaster Mensbigi, thus expressed himself about Dostoevsky: "It was Dostoevsky's friendly and helpful conversion that saved me from despair. His sensitiveness, his delicacy of feeling, his playful sallies, all this exercised a calming influence upon me." Dostoevsky belonged to a category of those beings of whom Michelet has said that, while the bravest of males, they have at the same time much of the feminine nature, close quote. The two men parted in tears at Tobolsk. The contracts with the Siberian prisoners left their mark. The contacts with the Siberian prisoners left their mark on almost everyone in Dostoevsky's later writings. As an intellectual, he was shunned by most of his fellow prisoners, but he made the strange discovery that amongst these outcasts there were, quote, "deep, strong, and beautiful natures, wonderful people," close quote, the victims of forces over which they had no control. Nietzsche, his later admirer, refers to Dostoevsky's observation about such men by calling them, quote, "the type of strong men made sick," close quote. In Siberia, Dostoevsky rediscovered his faith in Christ. He reported that God granted him at times moments of perfect serenity, and that there was nothing more beautiful, profound, and manly than the image of Christ. Such religious affirmations did not mean that he was free from religious doubts, but his Siberian exile, his rediscovery of Christ, his hope for the Orthodox Church, and his fervent devotion to Mother Russia characterized this most important phase of Dostoevsky's religious and artistic development. Contemporary discussion of the nature of Dostoevsky's work seemed to center around the question as to whether he was a novelist or a prophetic visionary. He was undoubtedly both, and in the light of recent European history, one might also classify him as a clairvoyant. His religious fervor and his art are and inseparably woven together, as his erratic nature and the suffering that gave him profound insight into human nature. Even if his characters spoke only of themselves and not necessarily for Dostoevsky, they nevertheless represent the vision and spirit of their time, their people, and their leaders. And it seems to have been Dostoevsky's design. Once, when speaking about the possessed, he said, quote, "I want to express certain ideas even if the artistic factor of my work are lost." Close quote. Dostoevsky's hectic career was not ended when he was released from the Katorga to serve for 5 years in the Siberian Line Battalion. His marriage to a widow of dubious reputation was the first of several unhappy and turbulent love experiences which tortured him as much as his many other problems. And these frustrations may account for the fact that none of his novels portray a happily married and harmonious couple. After returning to St. Petersburg, he started in 1861 the liberal magazine Vremya, Time, which preached populism, the need for closer collaboration between the intelligentsia and the people, and love for the Russian soil. Vremya also published his Insulted and Injured and the Memoirs from the House of the Dead, both significant because of their psychological insight, but a minor artistic quality. Some of Dostoevsky's smaller pieces, written as a vigorous critique of Western civilization, were also publicized in the same magazine. When the magazine was suspended by order of the political authorities, Dostoevsky started on his erratic odyssey into Europe, which left him forever restless and unsettled. Gambling away borrowed money, the unending problem of appeasing his publishers, an unhappy love affair, and his inability to manage his financial predicaments made him an unhappy and homesick man. After returning to Russia, he founded another magazine entitled Epoch. When bankrupt, lost his best friend, the journalist Gregoriov, his wife, and his brother Mikhail by death, and was led up hopelessly in debt. There followed more gambling in Germany, actual starvation, and endless financial embarrassment. Even the success of Crime and Punishment could not save him from his miseries. When he finally married again, he gambled away on his 2-year honeymoon in Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. Even the personal belongings of his wife, and seemed several times on the brink of complete collapse. He had indeed, quote, the vitality of a cat, close quote, since he was capable to produce the idiot and the possessed under circumstances which would have ruined the health and mind of any other writer. Once back on Russian soil, his creative energies increased, and his wife, Anna Gregovina, managed their finances in such a way that the final 10 years of his life became a period of quiet and even of comfort, with the exception of one more conflict with the political police, his Journal of a Writer, A Raw Youth, and lastly, the brothers Karamazov, made him, for many of his fellow countrymen, the uncontested leader of Russian thought. His famous Pushkin address, delivered half a year before his death, was a personal triumph of the highest order, fulfilling the claim of his disciples that Dostoevsky would rank among the greatest in Russian history, even indeed as the father of Russia's faith in her all-embracing destiny for Europe and for mankind. His personal appearance during the last years of his life was anything but patriarchal. Nervous, emaciated, and melancholy, his face appeared a mixture of that coarseness, subtlety, and sweetness which we have come to regard as typical of the Russian peasant. All of the qualities that had lived in the characters of his novels seemed engraved on his features: saintless, criminal distortion, the marks of the believer and skeptic, the volcanic zeal of the preacher, and the resignation of the martyr. Yet his death mask shows a face of ancestral distinction. Death had bestowed a clarity upon his features which suggested the rare spiritual victory of his Via Dolorosa. Dostoevsky has indeed shaped the thinking of generations, as did his contemporaries Bakunin, Tolstoy, Marx, and Darwin, all of whom wrote in one sense or another the laws of our time. Each of them and many others wrote his own preface to the disturbing chapters of Europe's history as we see it unfolding in the religious, moral, and political crisis of our age.